All right, this is your first experience with Schoology. What we're going to be doing is learning about comparative systems of government. In other words, the different types of government that have existed throughout history so you can get a clear understanding of our options. Yesterday we learned about English philosophers, and what we really did is talked about the people who thought, what would life be like without a government? What would it exist like? What would it look like? How would it interact day to day? Is it a place that you would want? And if it's bad, what are the alternatives? In other words, what's the best system for government? This all ties back into that whole idea of how do we get along. And so I want you to keep that in the back of your head as we're going through this idea of life without a government. What would it really be like? And then we'll talk about that. If the zombies rise up, what are we going to come back with? This whole idea of why have a government always comes back to this idea of balancing freedom and protection. This idea of what am I willing to sacrifice in order to feel safe and secure in my environment. And the hard thing with this is that it's different for everyone. Everyone's willing to give up certain things but not others. Simple debates we can talk about are the abortion debate and gun control. And so we see groups that say, yes, we should limit freedom here because I think A. But no, freedom is important. You can't take this away. And that's the struggle we have in society, is balancing those things out. Now in my room, you've seen the poster on the side that says you have 2 cows. What this is a way for, somewhat humorously, to talk about the different options, the different types of societies, and the way that things function. It starts with this simple metaphor, cows. If you have 2 cows, they symbolize your wealth, your property, your factors of production, what you need to survive. Here you and your spouse travel to the frontier in the early 1800s, and it's a prairie, and you've got this nice patch of land that's covered in all sorts of what we would call weeds today. I think Mr. Beatty wouldn't like that, but I disagree anyway. They look like weeds to me. And so what we would do is we would talk about, how are you going to survive? Well, you first need to build some kind of shelter. And if you have animals, you can use their dung to help build bricks. You can bring the animals in at night to help with heat. You can use the animals to help with labor as far as plows. Now, don't get me wrong, cows are not the ideal to pull a plow, but it's something that maybe you could get done. And in addition, they provide nutrients between milk, cheese, all of those things that you can produce. Today, we don't really think of cows. We think cows symbolizing money. Everything that you would buy that you used a cow for in the past, today you would just simply use money. Now, you don't live in a vacuum, meaning there's other outside influences on you. And that's what government is. They're the people who control how you use them. And so on the poster, in the metaphors that we'll go over, it's the idea that you have 2 cows. What system does the government create for you to use them? And then how are you affected by that? Really, it's just the rules of the game. And so when we think about this, government is like the referee. They're going to dictate how you can play the game. And here's what we have to know, is that depending on how the referees call the game, that predicts winners and losers, especially if only some people understand the rules of the game. And we'll talk about that situation more as we go on. Our first type of government we're going to talk about is, I guess, the simplest form of government. If you look back in history, this has always existed because it's no different than being on a playground. At some point, without regulation, what happens on a playground is that the smallest person takes over. Sorry, not smallest, strongest. So we're really talking about a dictatorship here. The idea that a single person is in charge of every facet of life. We could talk about this in terms of emperors and monarchs and kings and things like that, but really, at its core, the first of those groups, those first kings, the people who established that monarchy, were dictators. They completely controlled everyone's life. It's usually a military strongman. If you look at the pictures to the right, every one of those people you see in a military uniform. It's the idea that they're conveying subtly their strength in military prowess. The idea that they're in charge and they can use force to do their will. Dictators are not restricted by law. What I mean by that is that they make the law. They're above the law. They can create whatever laws they want and exempt themselves from it if they choose to. Citizens have no rights except for whatever is permitted by the dictator. So now we see a situation where people are completely protected from outside sources, but they have no freedom. And that's what I mean by this sliding scale of a lot of freedom, not much protection, a lot of protection, not much freedom. Because the dictator is going to control what's acceptable and what's not. And that works really well if you agree with the dictator, or even better, if you are the dictator. There is no hereditary succession. Hereditary means whatever's passed on. It's genealogical, it's within your family, and succession is who takes over next. So really, we're saying that the children do not become the next rulers. The person is in charge because they are the strongest. The next person will probably be the person that is the strongest then. So what we see is this series of violent rules. One of the biggest problems with dictators then is this idea of who takes over next. And then if somebody's a dictator for 5, 10 years, and that's it, every 5 or 10 years you're going to have this massive bloody revolt, this massive purging of people. And that leads to insecurity, which is what people don't like. People don't like not knowing. And a lot of times people will tolerate a bad situation out of fear for the future situation. Our second group is the next obvious progression, because our problem with dictators, aside from the whole, yeah, I have no rights, we understand that's bad, but the biggest problem with dictators is this idea of quality control, this idea of who takes over next, and this, how do we avoid this bloody revolt? And monarchs figured out a very good system for this. Now, they sacrificed quality sometimes for making sure that it was a smooth transition. Monarchy is a rule by a royal family. Meaning if you have the right last name, if you are born to the right parents, kind of that genetic lottery, you get to have more privileges. We could also argue more responsibilities, but more privileges and power than commoners. They do have hereditary succession, meaning the children become the next rulers. So this becomes simple. When the king dies, who takes over? Well, his son. Now, we did have queens, but typically it was the oldest male heir. And so this simplified the rule of who's going to take over in the next group. One of the ideas in favor of the monarchy, especially by intelligent people at the time, was the idea that these children were born and raised to govern. In other words, their entire education was built around how to be a good king or a good queen. They were far more learned in arts, in reading, in governing, in law, in finance, in military strategy than the average person. You have to remember, in the year 1100, very few people read. In the year 1500, still very few people read compared to today. Literacy rates were very, very low. The ruler has almost unlimited power, and we're not going to go into all the differences between like a constitutional monarchy and things like that, but you have to understand that in general, a ruler has almost unlimited power, similar to a dictator. Now, you have some strong kings and some weak kings, and obviously there's a lot of intrigue that goes into that. But in general, if the king is a powerful individual, they will be able to have the same basic authority as a dictator. And again, that means if the ruler has almost unlimited power, the citizens have almost no rights. Lastly for today is this idea of the next step. And this is something that people fear. The idea of a totalitarian government. Totalitarian, meaning total control. But instead of an individual or a family, it's the state. And by state, I don't mean Minnesota. I mean by the government agency. And the scary thing about this for people is the idea that when a king dies, maybe you'll get lucky and the next king is good. Maybe not. When a dictator dies, you know it's going to be a military strong person. A totalitarian government never dies. Think about Walt Disney. Walt Disney's been gone for quite a while, but Disney still keeps kicking out products. That's a totalitarian state. The government has complete control, and the individuals within the government have complete control. There are no limits to authority. You can think about China and their one-child policy. The government can dictate how many children you can have. And then they can set the rules on all of your freedoms. True totalitarian state controls thought even. They regulate every aspect of public and private life. Public and private life, meaning can you get married? Where do you go to school? Do you go to school? These are the things that we saw in that video, 2 million minutes, is a little bit of this strict regulation. You saw how just compliance takes over. Remember them doing their calisthenics where nobody looked enthused. Nobody was getting any exercise, but they were all forced to do it, and they sure knew it. Individual citizens then have no power to make decisions. So this is kind of the next logical step, because there is no transition of, uh-oh, we didn't produce a male heir. We're going to have this turmoil when the king dies. Nope. One totalitarian leader dies, the government already has other people working their way up this bureaucracy to take over. Tomorrow we will talk about two different types of totalitarian governments. Have a good night.